Joining me now is Jens Stoltenberg. He's the Secretary General of NATO. Mr. Secretary General, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I want to talk about NATO and spending and all of that, but first of all, another pressing issue, Venezuela, and it's one that a lot of NATO members are involved in. France, Spain, Germany, the UK, pressuring Maduro to hold elections in 7 days, or they will recognize Juan Guaido as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. Maduro sort of laughing at the idea. This situation in Venezuela, how tenuous do you think it is, and could it devolve into civil war?
It's a very serious situation, and many NATO allies try to help to find a solution. But I think the most important thing now is to avoid a civil war, avoid that violence is going to be used. And therefore, NATO allies support those efforts to try to find a negotiated solution.
Recently, here in Washington, D.C., the House voted overwhelmingly on a measure that would require congressional approval for the president to pull out of NATO, because the president has threatened that he will pull out of NATO if other NATO nations don't live up to their financial commitment. He has since said, I'm 100% behind NATO. Do you really have any concerns that President Trump would pull the United States out of the alliance?
So President Trump has been very clear. He is committed to NATO. He stated that clearly just a few days ago, and he did so also at the NATO summit in July. But at the same time, he has clearly stated that NATO allies need to invest more. And therefore, at the summit in July last year, we agreed to do more, to step up. And now we see the results. By the end of next year, NATO allies will add 100 billion extra US dollars for defense. So we see some real money and some real results, and we see that the clear message from President Trump is having an impact. NATO allies have heard the president loud and clear, and now NATO allies are stepping up. So this is good news, meaning that we actually see more fair burden sharing.
So that's interesting that you say that the NATO allies have heard the message, and it's a good thing, because President Trump gets roundly criticized here in the United States and abroad for being hostile to NATO, for putting too much pressure on them to live up to their financial commitments. So from your perspective, what he's saying, good thing or bad thing?
There is no doubt that his very clear message is having an impact. The message on the summit last summer was very clear, with all the leaders sitting around the table. And the message was that the US, President Trump, is committed to NATO, but we need fair burden sharing.
Right. So are you happy with what he's saying? I mean, did NATO nations, did NATO as an organization need a kick in the pants?
I'm happy with the fact that he has helped us to now move on the question of burden sharing within the alliance. And this is important for European allies. For a strong NATO is good for Europe, but it's also good for the United States. We have to remember that the only time we have invoked Article 5, our collective defense clause, was after an attack on the United States. And hundreds of thousands of Canadian, European soldiers have fought shoulder to shoulder with US soldiers in Afghanistan. We have worked together with US in defeating Daesh, ISIS in Iraq, Syria. So it's a great advantage for the United States to have 28 allies. Russia doesn't have that, China doesn't have that, but US has allies and friends.
You mentioned Russia, and one of the knocks on President Trump is what he says about President Putin, and his criticisms of NATO is giving Putin a way to try to create divisions within NATO. Listen to what Congressman Elliot Engel of New York said last week.
Today, NATO plays a critical role in keeping an increasingly aggressive Russia in check. And that's one of the reasons splintering the NATO alliance is one of Vladimir Putin's top goals. And that's why it's so disturbing, troubling to see the United States sending mixed signals about our commitment to the alliance or treating it as a burden.
Nancy Pelosi, the new Speaker of the House, went so far as to tweet on Friday night, why has the Trump administration continued to discuss pulling the U.S. out of NATO, which would be a massive victory for Putin? That could be connected to other issues regarding the president and Putin. But what President Trump is saying about NATO and the way he is saying it, is he giving an advantage to Putin here?
What he's doing is to help us adapt the alliance, which we need, because we live in a more unpredictable world with a more assertive Russia using violence or force against the neighbor, Ukraine. And therefore NATO has to adapt, partly by increasing the readiness of forces. We are doing that. Partly by stepping up our fight against terrorism. We are doing that with a new training mission in Iraq, but also partly by investing more. And you have to remember that the increase we now see in defense spending by European NATO allies comes after years of decline. So before they were cutting billions, now they're actually adding billions.
So you're not concerned that he's helping Putin splinter NATO like so many of his critics are?
What I see is that actually NATO is united because we are able to adapt to deliver. North America and Europe are doing more together now than before. We have more US troops in Europe, we have more exercises, so we welcome that, but we also welcome the fact that European allies are stepping up. And this is a clear message to Russia, and I think they see that.
In your mind, Mr. Secretary General, what is the greater threat to NATO? Is it that Russia may move into the Baltic states, or is it what's happening in the Black Sea and the Balkan area?
The challenge for NATO is that we are faced with many different threats at the same time. Russia using violence against neighbors, but also Daesh, ISIL in the south, and then cyber proliferation of nuclear weapons. So therefore, we are now in the midst of the biggest reinforcement of NATO since the end of the Cold War.
There is real concerns in some circles that Vladimir Putin may make a play on a little part of Estonia called Narva. If he were to do that, Estonia is a NATO member, would that invoke Article 5?
First of all, we don't see any imminent threat against any NATO ally, and that includes also Estonia. Second, the main reason why we have NATO is to prevent the conflict, is to prevent war, because as long as all NATO allies make it clear that an attack on one ally will trigger a response from the whole alliance, then no adversary will try to be aggressive against NATO, because they know that we are by far the strongest alliance in the world. Half of the world's economic might and half of the world's military might is within NATO. So as long as we stand together, we prevent conflict.
Mr. Secretary General, thanks for being with us. We'll see you next December in Brussels.
Yes.
All right.